Hi there. My name is Rob Wood. I'm a former federal CISO. I was at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services for just shy of 4 years. And with the government shutdown in effect, I have been getting questions. Joining the meeting. What's your take on what, how this is impacting cybersecurity at the agencies and industry writ large? As somebody who's lived through or gone through at least one of the more prolonged shutdowns when I was in federal service, I wanted to offer some of my perspectives on exactly that. So I have seen on LinkedIn a lot of campy caricatures of how these shutdowns can impact cybersecurity resources. It's almost as though the blue team is literally sitting at the edges of networks, kind of swatting people away or keeping people out or making a determination on every single connection, inbound or outbound, that is happening. Of course, that's not really how things work, but there are very real operational implications that we are going through and that the government is going through as it pertains to cyber. So first of those is when it comes to federal employees being furloughed. Every agency is a little bit different here. CMS, for example, is very dependent on contractors. The federal employee to contractor ratio was very significantly skewed in the direction of contractors, and government employees were more program or task leads on these different functional areas. So when they're not around, there's nobody to direct the contractors. There's no federal resource in place to make these decisions. And so it can cause delays in terms of things getting done. It can also cause delays in budget or resources getting allocated if there's overtime surges or anything like that, purchasing decisions, all of that gets put on hold. That is a problem. For agencies that are more heavily skewed in the other direction, where federal employees are doing more of that operational work, of course, if those folks are not there, if they are furloughed, that work is just simply not happening. And it's not just about monitoring logs and SOC analysts and incident responders, those kind of folks. There's a lot of things that impact cybersecurity. Access reviews, patching, modernization projects, all of that stuff has an implication or has implications for cybersecurity posture of systems and of the organizations they're a part of. So if things are not being patched, if systems are not being migrated off of these old legacy stacks, that is problematic. You're accumulating more and more tech debt, and that tech debt will come back to bite you. Technology atrophies over time. Vulnerabilities are identified in tools and software, and they're published in bug bounties and CVEs, and those things are exploited. And that is a very real dynamic that organizations have to wrestle with. That's one of the rat races of vulnerability management in an enterprise. So that is one big issue that is a dynamic that is at play amidst the government shutdown, is the operational burden. The other thing, and this is more of a trickle down impact for the private sector, is threat intelligence. Threat intelligence teams that are facing a setback, particularly those that might come out of these like centralized fusion center groups, like CISA, HHS has a group as well that shares intelligence across the agency and in some cases down across the sector. If those groups are not working at full capacity, that intelligence is not being processed and shared, disseminated to the groups that rely on it. That can be a problem, especially for dependent organizations. And so, you kind of follow that trail to its inevitable conclusion, and you arrive at the fact that that is another big issue. Now, having people on staff to make decisions and respond to things and process paperwork and all of that is another big issue. And that sounds bureaucratic in nature or in general. And it is, I get it. But just yesterday, there was a big AWS outage. Now, if any government systems were impacted, and I just read a LinkedIn post just prior to jumping into this about some components in GovCloud even though GovCloud was not one of the affected regions. It was US East, US East 1, if I memory serves me correctly, that the components in GovCloud were impacted as a result of, or as an extension of, this US East issue. Now, systems that are then reliant on these components, and there's a lot of federal civilian agencies that are reliant on AWS commercial as opposed to AWS GovCloud. And that's just, that's another kind of cost dynamic that is at play in federal technology procurement and management and all of that. But for systems that need to come back up, if those system administrators or system operators are not considered essential, or the contract teams are not considered essential, they're not working, and therefore government sites or services may not be available, or the recovery of those services may be delayed in general for extended periods of time. That is also problematic. Now, the last bit that I wanted to flag here is around contracting. Now, this has a few different layers to it, but for a lot of agencies, they're dealing extensively with small businesses to support the work that they do from a contractor standpoint. Now, small businesses can only float people who are not billing in these federal contracting roles for so long. So there may be organizations that are having to let people go on account of the shutdown, depending on how long it goes. And that will leave vacancies, that will leave work that needs to be done but is not able to get done, because then those roles need to be backfilled. Another component of this is private sector organizations that are dependent on the government for grants or any sort of federal funding support. If those contracting officers or procurement officers are not working, if they are furloughed in the agencies where this is applicable, that money is not flowing. That money's not going anywhere. And therefore, those organizations end up taking a hit. And so this could happen in nonprofits, research organizations, and healthcare organizations. And that can be a big problem, especially if there's any cybersecurity functions in those organizations that are dependent on that funding. So it is a thing. There's this accumulation of tech and organizational debt across the board in times of shutdown. And it will probably take time to unpack and basically get back to a state of normalcy once the shutdown clears. So while it's not as campy or caricature-y as not having people at the gates to swat the bad guys away as they're trying to come in and steal our secrets, there are very real operational hits and operational burdens that agencies and organizations, depending on the government, are facing. So anyways, I hope that's helpful. Hit me up if you want to discuss anything more about this, particularly having gone through it. I'm happy to lend my perspective. All right. Thank you. Talk soon.